Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project here, and your pinch moderator today. Our originally scheduled moderator, Dr. Sonia Michel, was being held hostage the last few days in Europe by a volcano, but we're pleased to report that she is in flight, if not already landed, and she'll hopefully be back here with us tomorrow. But it's my pleasure to be able to introduce this panel to you, and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion. As you know, the panel is really centered on a new book, The Other Alliance, Student Protest in West Germany and the United States in the Global Sixties by Martin Klimkin. And this is a wonderful read. It brought back a lot of memories. Some of us are actually old enough to remember the 60s, and we were there, but we still remember. And so this does bring back a lot of things that did take place during that turbulent decade. I've asked each of our speakers, starting with the author and then our two commentators, to speak for approximately 15 minutes, after which we'll have any follow-up questions or comments among the panel, and then open it up to you in the audience for questions, and we'll ask that you await a microphone and then identify yourself and your affiliation before asking your question. This is being webcast live, so we ask if you have any electronic devices to please turn those off, because they do interfere with the transmission and our audio system. So I appreciate that. Martin, you all have in front of you more detailed biographies, so I will just briefly introduce each of our speakers in the order in which they will be presenting. Martin Klimkin, the author, is a research fellow at the German Historical Institute of Washington, D.C., and his research focuses on the intersection of political and cultural history as well as transnational history, and his center is about a few blocks from here, DuPont Circle, as I understand it, and he manages to get back to Germany every few weeks. So I think he's on hold right now, though, until things clear up a little bit. Our first commentator will be Michael Kaizen, who is a professor of history at Georgetown University, where he specializes in the history of politics and social movements in the United States. We were pleased to have Michael here as a fellow a few years back, during which time he wrote a very important book, Ungodly Hero, The Life of William Jennings Bryan. And if you haven't read that, please do. It was named in 2006 as one of the best books of the year by several newspapers, including the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times. Our third presenter will be Jeremy Varon, and is Associate Professor of History at the New School for Social Research and is at Eugene Lang College, where he specializes in modern U.S. history. He has a book titled, somewhat similar to this, Bringing the War Home, The Weather Underground, the Red Army Faction and the Revolutionary Violence in the 60s and 70s. So with that, I will turn things over to the author, Martin, for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Don, for the kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming here this afternoon. My first expressions of gratitude go, of course, to the Wilson Center for generously hosting this event, and to Richard Iserman, Christian Ostermann, and in particular Sonia Michel, who, as Don said, is unfortunately trapped in Europe today. Now, as many of you know, the original date for this event was in January, but the surprising snowfall back then forced us to postpone this, so it's kind of a sad irony that the weather has again taken its toll on us. Now, as Don said, we are asked to speak about 15 minutes, and my task was to introduce you to The Other Alliance, to the book that I just wrote. And I began working on this book about 10 years ago when I was teaching at Amherst College, and I was looking at the microfilm edition of the papers of the American SDS, the Students for American Society, and I came across a section on West Germany, and that got me curious, and subsequent oral interviews with 60s activists both in the US and in Germany soon revealed that there was a much larger story here. What gradually emerged was a story about a transnational alliance of activists developing during the 1960s, which ran counter to the official transatlantic partnership between the United States and the Federal Republic, a counter-alliance which in many ways contested the very nature and legitimacy of the two countries' official relationship during the Cold War. And this is what I call the Other Alliance. Now, from the very beginning, so I found, these activists and members of the self-described New Left emerged in a transatlantic context. First developed in Great Britain in the late 50s under the influence of thinkers such as E.P. Thompson, Stuart Hall, and Ralph Miliband, the idea of a New Left was carried over to the U.S. by, among others, the sociologist C. Wright Mills, and picked up by the American SDS. Now, activists on both sides of the Atlantic had much in common. First, the rejection of traditional Marxism and its focus on the working class. Second, a fundamental dissatisfaction with the Cold War, its anti-communism, and its continuous threat of nuclear extinction. And third, the condemnation of society's social and political apathy, materialism, and capitalist mindset. Now, the first transatlantic people-to-people contact between the New Left in West Germany and the U.S. came as a result of the visit of Michael Fester, then Vice President and International Secretary of the German SDS, to the U.S. in 1961. Studying in the U.S. on a Fulbright grant, Fester soon established contact with the then fairly small American SDS and its most active members, Al Haber and Tom Hayden. And they both asked Fester to become active in American SDS by setting up new chapters in various universities along the East Coast. And as I show in the book, Fester subsequently played a significant role in the formulation of the Port-Huron Statement in the summer of '62. He offered feedback and suggestions on Tom Hayden's early drafts of the manifesto and actually took part in the Port-Huron Conference, where he clearly shaped the position of American SDS and NATO and the Cold War in Europe in the final version of what was to become one of the most influential manifestos for '60s activists in the United States. Now, as a consequence of Fester's visit, American and German SDS not only established a permanent transatlantic network of cooperation and exchange. After his return, Fester also introduced German SDS to the American left, to C. Wright Mills theories, the concept of direct action as practiced by the civil rights, anti-war, and the free speech movements. His writings and his plea for what he called the participatory democracy, one of the key signature phrases of the American SDS, were largely responsible for introducing direct action as a vital political strategy to West Germany. Influenced by these American examples, the German student movement now established direct action techniques as a regular component in their protest repertoire, employing them first in places such as West Berlin and Frankfurt, but soon all over the country. One could even argue that the German student movement's strategic violation or ridicule of conventions or rules to capture public attention by using sit-ins, teach-ins, or go-ins ultimately paved the way for a social and cultural change that was far greater than the quote-unquote political changes the students were after. Now, these American techniques, however, had profoundly different ideological implications and consequences in a West German context. For the anti-authoritarian faction around West German student leader Rudi Dutschke, they merged into a blend of revolutionary theories composed of situationist ideas, the minority theory of Herbert Marcuse, a voluntaristic concept of revolution advocated by George Lucas, as well as Che Guevara's Foucault theory. In the late 60s, the opposition to the war in Vietnam further deepened the relationship between West German and U.S. activists. For West German activists, Vietnam epitomized the global reach of imperialism and the need for a global revolutionary alliance between activists in the First World and the liberation movements in the Third World. The German-American dimension was a central axis in the effort to institutionalize this particular alliance in the course of 1968. An international news and research institute set up after a Vietnam Congress in Berlin as the coordinating center for revolutionary movements worldwide. Rudi Dutschke's plans to come to San Diego to study with Herbert Marcuse, Bernardine Dorn's visit to the SDS Convention 1968 in Frankfurt, as well as numerous international conferences in the course of '68, all underlined the particular closeness between West German and American activists. And an additional facet of this alliance was the growing attraction Black Power held for West German students. For the German SDS was part of an international class conflict that also manifested itself in the national liberation movements in Asia, Africa, and South America. Showing solidarity with black power is therefore part of fighting against global capitalism and imperialism. Now, the fact that the African-American struggle was situated in a first world country with close ties to the Federal Republic made the transatlantic identification even easier for West German activists. As Frankfurt SDS member Volker Brandes wrote in '68, and I quote, "In the struggles of black America intensifying year after year, we see the hope for an end to oppression and exploitation, for ourselves as well. Because international as the oppression is, the fight against it is equally international," end quote. Black Panther solidarity committees that resulted from contacts between Bobby Seale, Erich Cleaver, and former German SDS President Karl Dietrich Wolff institutionalized this attraction at the end of the decade. And these committees also launched a massive Angela Davis campaign at the beginning of the 70s, and you find many examples and images of the encounters between German and American activists in the book. But just as American direct action techniques became part of a comprehensive revolutionary theory when imported to West German context, so too was black power transformed in its appropriation. At the beginning of the 70s, it merged for many West German students with an increasing fascination with Frantz Fanon's theories on decolonization and the liberating features of violence. In particular, in the case of the Red Army faction, black power and post-colonial redefinitions of identity fatefully blended with coming to terms with the National Socialist past, thus developing into a especially ruthless German template for the so-called armed struggle that is the terrorism that hit the country in the 1970s. Now, eventually, however, this other transatlantic alliance fell far short of its goals and failed in toppling the national order of the Cold War. Now, this doesn't mean that it had no effect on political decision makers, and I deal with the extensive government reaction these activists triggered in the second half of my book. The problems of international youth had been a major concern for the U.S. government since the beginning of the 1960s. In April 1962, an Interagency Youth Committee was established in the Department of State after Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and George McKee demanded a stronger integration of youth as a prime target of U.S. cultural diplomacy. Now, dedicated to coordinate an adequate foreign policy response to communist propaganda, the Interagency Youth Committee was designed to centralize efforts to build up a deep understanding of the U.S. among foreign countries' educated young leaders. And the committee not only assembled representatives from various branches of the Department of State on a regular basis all through the 60s, but also leading officials from Department of Defense, from the Agency for International Development, the United States Information Agency, the CIA, and the Peace Corps took part in its proceedings. U.S. posts overseas, which had to establish local youth committees and coordinators, were equally included in this institutional infrastructure. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, President John F. Kennedy, President Johnson, and Vice President Hubert Humphrey became avid proponents of the committee's work and often advocated forcefully on its behalf. At the end of '66, for example, the committee, recognizing the rich transnational exchange among certain groups of youthful protesters, initiated a specific study on European youth, since there seemed to be a rich transnational exchange among certain groups involved in protest activities. The committee was worried that these transatlantic connections might replicate American domestic dissent in a European context. And as chairman of the committee, Foy Kohler, the former ambassador of the U.S. to Moscow, phrased it, and I quote, "Do contacts between America's New Left and the European youth help or hurt as far as the national interest is concerned? If there is in fact an international network of contacts that embraces the New Left, SNCC, etc., what does it mean? What function does it serve in our overall relationships with the European youth?" In the following years, the Department of State even contracted academics to survey the attitudes of European youth, such as historian Fritz Stern for West Germany. And the European visit of Vice President Hubert Humphrey in '67 and the massive student protests it provoked underscored the seriousness of the situation and finally alerted the State Department to the disturbing level of the anti-war sentiment and to protesting students as a new political force in West Germany. And from then on, American officials increasingly dedicated time and resources to monitoring the German student movement extensively. But what's important in this context is that these reactions with regard to Germany stand in the context of a much larger effort to come to terms with the international dimension of student unrest. After the May events of '68 in France, Secretary of State Dean Rusk urged all American diplomatic posts, for example, to watch these national trends because they may foreshadow future national policies. In addition, a student unrest study group chaired by the former ambassador of West Germany, George McGee, dedicated itself to revising policy guidelines as a reaction to student unrest worldwide. On September 18th of 1968, a CIA report on restless youth that analyzed student movements in 19 countries even provoked a heated discussion in President Johnson's cabinet meeting, revealing a surprisingly narrow focus on communist conspiracies among some members of the administration. In other words, by the beginning of '69, the U.S. government had thus amply analyzed the potential threat student unrest posed to its foreign policy interests and decided to react to what it saw as an international problem in its individual country programming. That meant that American cultural diplomacy for West Germany from then on primarily concentrated on university and advanced high school students as the principal target audience for any embassy or USAID-sponsored programs. What was first perceived as an imitation of the free speech movement at Berkeley and part of an international movement against the war in Vietnam thus gradually came to be considered a far more serious problem for American foreign policy. Many American officials feared that the ideology of student protesters might resonate within the established parties of West Germany, thereby causing a leftist turn in the new social liberal administration of Willy Brandt coming into office in 1969. American diplomats were concerned that this could not only help foster independent German efforts at détente, but even more worrisome, lead the country potentially to withdrawal from NATO or to take a neutralist position in the Cold War. In other words, they were afraid that the idea of an alternative geopolitical order outside the traditional power blocks between East and West would gain ground among the political elite and future leaders in the Federal Republic. Because for this new generation of West German activists, the immediate war experience, the Cold War confrontation of earlier years, as well as Manichaean rhetoric conjuring up a Soviet threat, had long been replaced by fundamental concerns over détente between the superpowers or other global issues, such as the North-South divide. And it was precisely this ideological transformation which recast the transatlantic relationship from below that American foreign policy crucially needed to adjust to. And this, I argue in the book, was the more serious long-term challenge that global protest movements and the other alliance presented throughout the '60s.
Thank you very much. Michael?
Thank you, Don. Thanks to Sonia, absently. Hi, Sonia. She'll probably see this later on, for inviting me and Jeremy and, of course, Martin to talk about what is a really fascinating book. I should also say that Norman Birnbaum is here, one of the creators of the American New Left and someone who was very involved with the creation of the German New Left, too, I believe. So be interesting to hear your thoughts later on about this, Norman.
British, Michael.
Well, but very involved with the Germans as well, so later on. Well, I should first say that it's quite a feat to say something truly new about the student radicalism of the 1960s. It's an overworked subject, and I think Martin really has made a really important contribution to our understanding of the movement on both sides of the ocean, and of course, especially of the interaction between the two movements. Jeremy, I think, is going to focus more on the historiographical contributions of the book. I want to say a few things about what I think the highlights of the book are, and then offer not so much criticisms of the book, but criticisms of what one could call the transnational turn in studies of the 1960s, especially the 1960s left. To two highlights for me of the book. First of all, Martin's chapter on the links between the Black Panthers and the German New Left, especially the inspiration that the Panthers gave to the Red Army faction later on, which Jeremy has written half a book about, that is Red Army faction. This is really new material, at least to me. Perhaps not to Jeremy, but it's a wonderful chapter, worth the price of admission all by itself. Secondly, the material that Martin was just talking about the transatlantic partnership, if we can call it that, between the German and American governments worried about the student movement. And especially a group about which I had never heard even so much as the name before I read Martin's book, the Interagency Committee on Youth Affairs, which I Googled, of course, right away, and only one reference came up, Martin's book. So he's done historians of the 1960s and of the transatlantic left a great service with this chapter and with these, the book as a whole, but especially, I think, these chapters I've mentioned. And also, if you look in the footnotes, which of course every good scholar does, you see that it was Martin's work to get the papers of this agency declassified. Perhaps he'll now write a book about the agency itself, or at least some longer articles about it, because it's a fascinating part of Cold War diplomacy, which I knew nothing about. And in fact, the influence of Robert Kennedy in that agency, which he just mentioned in passing a few minutes ago, is fascinating. Robert Kennedy, of course, was a hero to a lot of people on the American New Left, including Tom Hayden, who, even though he was by the time of Kennedy's assassination a avowed revolutionary, nevertheless he went to Kennedy's funeral and put a campaign hat he'd been given by Fidel Castro on Kennedy's coffin. So. I should also say that these chapters on the Interagency Committee and a lot of the things that Martin was just talking about do remind one of some of the excellent transnational scholarship that's been done on the 1960s by people like Mary Dudziak, Cold War Civil Rights, Thomas Borstelman, similar topic, and by Jeremy Suri about the transatlantic or international youth culture of the time. But I want to spend the little time that I have being a bit quarrelsome. As I said before, I want to push back a little bit at the wave of transnational history, of which Martin's book is a fine example, as is the work of the two distinguished editors of the Princeton University Press series, in which the book appears, Sven Beckert and Jeremy Suri. I want to say a little bit about the huge and significant differences between the U.S. and German New Lefts. In the rush to be transnational, which is happening everywhere in the historical discipline, we run the risk, I think, of forgetting the significance of national political cultures and of national historical contexts. We also run the risk of assuming that because transnational connections existed, they must have been influential on the movements in question. I should confess my own biography has something to do with my perspective on this matter. I was one of those restless youth that the Interagency Committee was so concerned with. I was a member of the American SDS from 1966 until it split apart in 1969, and then I was briefly part of Weatherman, though I was fortunate enough or smart enough to quit in 1969, just before the organization went underground and began bombing things. And one of the things that surprised me about Martin's book was that I'd heard so little back then about the connections that he talked about. I attended a group in a meeting he discusses at Columbia, the International Assembly of Revolutionary Student Movements, held at Columbia in the fall of 1968, several months after the famous or infamous Columbia student strike. But it seemed like a blip in the history of the time. I heard the name of Karl Dietrich Wolff, but no one ever talked about him beyond just the name. And I was in and out of the SDS national office a lot, and was briefly at least part of a sort of national leadership group of the organization. The connections internationally we really cared about were not in Europe at all. They were in the Third World, especially Vietnam and Cuba, and for the Maoists among us, China. Even for some, Albania. That was brief. Of course, we were glad to have comrades across the Atlantic, and everyone knew the names of Rudi Dutschke and Daniel Cohn-Bendit and Bernadette Devlin in Ireland, for that matter. But our focus was always on doing whatever we could to help the Vietnamese who were fighting our own country, and to build our alliance at home with black radicals and other radicals of color, in particular the Black Panther Party, which was very open to alliances with white radicals like us. With the exception of the events in France in the spring of 1968, nothing that happened in Europe was all that important to us. Or at least, again, that's how it seemed from my point of view at the time. And the French 68 mattered so much because of the millions of workers who got involved, not just because of the students who were throwing up barricades in the streets of Paris. For a brief time, we imagined naively that France, the country of revolution, was close to having another revolution. We never thought that about the Federal Republic or about Italy or anywhere else on the continent at the time. So, with that as a sort of autobiographical preface, I want to highlight what I see as three big differences between the American and German student movements. First of all, the significance of the Black Freedom Movement itself. That movement was, in the words of Bernice Regan, a member of the Freedom Singers of SNCC, and retired now from American University in Washington, the Borning struggle. Its organizers, its leaders, its language, its indictment of American society, all inspired and directed, in many ways, the white New Left. It was enlightening to read in Martin's book about the impact of the Panthers and of Angela Davis and of George Jackson on the German New Left. But in the U.S., slavery and racism were what the Nazi past was for young German radicals, a source of rage, of guilt, and the impetus for concerted, militant, strident action to destroy its vestiges in U.S. society. By the way, I find it curious reading Martin's book and knowing something else, reading some other works about the German New Left, including Jeremy's book, that the German New Left seems to have done and said very little in the 60s about the problem or problems of guest workers who were streaming into the Federal Republic in the 1960s from Turkey and Yugoslavia and other parts of Europe and the Near East. One would think that this new group of exploited workers would have been commented on a lot by German leftists, who, after all, were at the core still Marxists, though of a different variety than those east in the Democratic Republic. Were they seen as a reserve army of labor? Were they seen as a threat to the interests of the domestic working class? Or was the internationalism of the German New Left the primary emotion that came into play when their analyses were made of these guest workers? Or was very little said about them at all? I'm really curious about this, because from an American perspective, it would seem that this group was roughly analogous, perhaps, to African American workers in the United States, though, of course, without the long history of African Americans in this country. This seems like an important silence in the book, and perhaps an important silence at the time in the thinking of the German New Left. Second point of difference. The American New Left had a deeply ambivalent, one might even say schizoid relationship with U.S. history, with our own history. On the one hand, we embraced, accepted, celebrated the analysis of William Mountain Williams and Gabriel Kolko and others of the U.S. as an expanding empire, from the conquest of Native Americans to the war in Vietnam. It seemed like American history was one long march to take over other people's territory and to boss them around. So we rejected the celebratory type of American exceptionalism quite explicitly. On the other hand, we couldn't stop ourselves from hailing American ideals. American ideals proclaimed the Declaration of Independence, and by past radicals like Frederick Douglass, Eugene Debs, Emma Goldman, and those pillars of the Popular Front like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and Paul Robeson. Martin mentions a great speech that Carl Oglesby, the president of SDS, gave in 1865 down by the Washington Monument. I'm old enough to have been there. A speech that was full of phrases about how his American heart was broken by liberal war makers. Oglesby compared in that speech the Vietnamese Revolution to the American Revolution as a way of saying, if you celebrate the Vietnamese Revolution, you have to endorse and celebrate the American Revolution too. So American New Leftists had a romance with the American past, a troubled romance to be sure, but still a romance. But obviously, in contrast, young Germans, less than a quarter century removed from the Third Reich, could not have such an analogous sentiment about their past. The third and last difference is a demographic one. The movement in the United States was much larger than that in the Federal Republic. There were so many more college students in this country, so many more people living in campus communities, and not just because of the difference in the populations. Martin has a great graph on page 210 of the book, which you should all buy. It's out there, which charts the student explosion in various Western European countries and the United States in the 1950s and 60s. The two nations, the Federal Republic and the U.S., according to this graph, experienced about the same increase from 1950 to 1967 of college students, basically 300% in the 17-year period. But that left the U.S. at the end of the period with 6.3 million college students, the Federal Republic with only 370,000 college students. That means per capita, there were 5 American college students for every 1 college student in West Germany. And of course, colleges were and are everywhere in the United States, and there are more private ones than public ones. In contrast to the mostly public system in the Federal Republic and the location of most universities in major cities or state capitals. This meant, I think, that what was happening on campus in the U.S. had an outsized impact on American culture and American politics, and as Martin demonstrates quite well, on the rest of the world as well. It also made it possible for the radical student movement in this country to be, along with groups like the Panthers, the face of the American left in the 1960s. This led, as many of you know, to a conflict with parts of the organized labor movement in this country, with liberals in the anti-war movement, and in the end did not have good consequences for the fate of either reform or radicalism in the ensuing decades. In some ways, in the United States at least, we're still living with the fallout from the 1960s. But in conclusion, again, I want to hail Martin for writing a fascinating and truly original book. That's a very rare thing in our discipline, and something to celebrate and something to purchase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Both of you have done very well in keeping within the time constraints. By the way, Mike mentioned to me before our session here that he is currently working on a history of the New Left in the U.S. Is that correct? Or?
It's the whole American left, actually, from the abolitionists to the present.
Okay, thank you. With that, I'll turn things over to Jeremy.
Okay, and then apologies for my intermittent coughs. I'm, fighting a cold. Let me proceed a little bit more informally by beginning to say that, in the sake of full disclosure, Martin is a friend of mine. I'm a big fan of his. But I assure you that the personal affection followed from the intellectual admiration and attraction, and not the other way around. Martin is a gifted and bold thinker who researches with Teutonic rigor, I will say, politely. He's also extremely generous with his time and intellect, and has been a tireless organizer of conferences all over the world, especially in Europe, precisely about the global 60s. And as much as anybody, he has promoted global dialogue about the global 60s themselves. And that, in sort of the best sense of the word, seems to me, or the best sense of the idea, seems, itself sort of very 60s, trying to build, bridges across, cultures and identities, and promote various forms of transnational understanding. Now, as to the intellectual attraction, I'll say a couple things. First, we have swum in the same waters. We're probably the foremost researchers of the German and American New Lefts together. It's just a fact. It's not sort of good or bad. It's just, the case. So I've been, preoccupied with the same things as Martin. But I should say more personally, I have a German mother who came to the United States in 1957, a Turkish father who came to the U.S. at the same time, who also happens to be Jewish. Both of them arrived in America with a certain skepticism toward this country. My mother thought Americans were puritanical and tacky, as she would always like to say, anti-intellectual. But both she and my father did appreciate a certain quality of freedom they didn't experience in their home societies. I think this is very, sort of common immigrant story. They raised me within a certain cosmopolitan frame of mind. And then here, our backgrounds might be meaningful. You were very much an American and committed to improving this society. And then I always had this sense of, the larger world and some commitment to it. I've been a creature of the left. So I feel like in an almost comical way, I'm the embodiment of all these sort of layered identities: Jewish, German, American, left-wing, sort of Turkish. And then Martin's work has helped me, understand aspects of my own roots by excavating both the official alliance between Germany and the United States that my mother benefited from enormously, raised on chocolate and American movies, but also the other alliance of, dissidents. And he helps look at the sort of long arc of this enduring ambivalence that Germans have towards the United States, whereas the great sort of moral and economic benefactor, and yet affiliating with America meant being potentially complicit in the recklessness of the post-war American empire. And that ambivalence still permeates German identity in profound ways. The German agony over the war in Afghanistan is very much the agony over the American alliance, still in the shadow of Vietnam. Bush-strained relations, the German embrace of Obama, I think shows how much Germans want to believe again in the myth of America. And then many Germans say, oh, I love the country, love the people, love the culture, hate the politics, hate the power. Some of the people you quote say that. It's sort of too simple, because the country's power itself explains why American culture has so much resonance globally, and why the American people are known in some intuitive way by folks all over the world, even if they've never, been here. So that's, a dimension of why this work resonates with me so strongly. Now I want to speak more from a scholarly perspective and talk about where it fits into the evolving conversation about the 60s that scholars are having, and the distinct and significant contributions it makes to the current scholarship. I should say that I edit a journal on the 60s. Martin's on the editorial board. It's called The 60s, appropriately titled. So it's my job to sort of track the field and how it's evolving. And then lately, a lot of the energy, one could argue too much, has been studying the global 60s. And then in 2008 in particular, which was the 40th anniversary of 1968, the quintessential global year where so many things happened all over the world, there was a torrent of conferences internationally to look at the global 60s. Off the top of my head, ones in Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Prague, New York. Martin organized half of them. Philadelphia, Athens, Berlin, Kingston, Ontario, etc. And then the idea of the global 60s was tossed around very prodigiously, but often defined with very little rigor. It seemed to mean, everything and nothing. And then part of what I've tried to do is parse the various meanings of the term. And I think that will help us understand where Martin fits in. Okay, so the global 60s, I think, talk about Teutonic rigor, 11 categories, or 9 categories. First and most basically, the notion that the 60s happened almost everywhere. Countless societies experienced radical challenges to established forms of political and cultural authority. These challenges varied in quality and intensity and ideological outlook, but they're almost always anti-authoritarian, broadly defined. Second, the idea that so much protest energy was a response to foreign affairs or what were perceived as global events. So it's happening everywhere, people are responding to global events. And clearly the key catalytic event was the Vietnam War, the opposition to which took on the status of a global crusade. And this is something a lot of Americans sort of don't know, that this was the issue, more or less, in much of Europe and even parts of the Third World. Third, dissidents developed, or at least tried to develop, a systemic analysis of global power, or put another way, of power as global. In much of the world, the central construct was imperialism, and in the so-called Third World, its salience was utterly assumed, because people were presumably feeling its direct effects. However, the analysis of imperialism did penetrate the advanced industrial world, including the United States, including Germany, and became a sort of common analytic coin, particularly in the late 1960s, arguably for better and for worse. In addition, there was some effort to posit bureaucracy as such, or administrative rationality as sort of the arch negative construct that had a democratic capitalist and a scientific socialist manifestation. So radicals in Prague and Paris could feel an intuitive connection to one another, combating a common enemy of state authority, even though one was communist and one was capitalist. Following this is category number 4, radicals had a subjective sense of solidarity among one another and the common belief that they were fighting on different fronts of the same broad struggle. And this is articulated by, Paul Potter in a famous speech in the United States. And almost every country had an ideologue sort of testifying to this sense of global struggle. Now, often it was merely rhetorical. It could lead to dangerous conflations of context, which I thoroughly analyze in my own book. It could lead to psychotic affinities like the Western admiration for the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It sometimes, however, led to genuine efforts to aid and abet other movements in dire need of support. Rhetorical political support for the Vietnamese, money and various forms of humanitarian aid, to the north, Germans providing sanctuary for GI resistors in German cities and towns, work brigades going to Cuba to help harvest sugarcane, and all kinds of stuff that we would largely see as benign, not naive as cynical. As a subset of this is something Surrey explores, but also Martin. There appear to have been, some have argued, a functional alliance between otherwise warring elites, namely Brezhnev, Nixon, Brandt, et al., worried collectively about domestic dissent and then the threat it posed to all of them mutually. And in the thesis of Jeremy Surrey, perhaps overdone, he wants to argue that détente was essentially concocted among adversaries to produce an illusion of cooperation to restore a sense of trust among increasingly skeptical publics who thought that the major powers did not any longer have a handle on Cold War conflict and were imperiling the globe as it appeared to heat up. Okay, category 5, the dimension of inspiration from foreign sources. And one of the radicals I interviewed said, the Vietnamese brilliantly lit up the 60s for many of us. Okay, so there's this sort of image of illumination, that there were these great beacons of a sort of new, emergent, emancipated humanity in whose glow everybody could bask. If a peasant nation of 14 million can defeat the most powerful military superpower on earth, why can't we do the impossible too? Okay, so the Third World was a source of inspiration, as was the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Arguably, the long arc of decolonization was the greatest sort of structural variable in instigating the 60s, insofar as colonized people, broadly understood, were struggling for their own freedom. And, there's India in the 40s, there's a host of countries in Africa in the 50s and 60s, of course, the Vietnamese. The arc is very, very long, but it kind of came to a head in the 50s and 60s. Okay, category 6. People had a systemic conception of power and then also a systemic conception of emancipation, albeit crude. The notion that the world could be emancipated from imperialism, eventuating in something like a comprehensive global emancipation that would sort of right the essential wrongs of the species. And then this is the most robust expression of 60s utopianism. 5 minutes? Okay. So the folks were sort of international in outlook, but also internationalist in ambition. Category 7, I'll just say very briefly, the notion of the transnational diffusion of ideas, people, musics, and styles, and this is, I think, the sweet spot of Martin's work. Category 8, direct observation and imitation, sort of literally borrowing from the tactics of others as you observe them. And famously in Paris, they knew about the occupations of universities in Colombia, and the ones in Colombia, sort of aided and abetted the imagination of radicals in Mexico, and so on. And then the last category, I think this is very often overlooked, is a sort of ethical normative category for understanding the global 60s. The sense of connection that especially young people had to and responsibility for the other. This assumption that you are your brothers and sisters' keeper. Martin Luther King said very beautifully, in a real sense, all of life is interrelated, tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And for folks in the 60s, this was a political, not simply a cosmic axiom that came with a moral obligation to do something to help, the suffering other. Okay, so then the big question in the scholarship is, how do you ultimately account for similarities across boundaries and the simultaneity of protest. And then some folks want to say that these similarities of outlook, ideology, desire, and sensibility are a consequence of affinities of circumstance that are systemic in nature. And then this is a very productive approach, but it can lead to overly broad and general explanations that can even become metaphysical. And there's this guy, George Katsafikis, who wrote a book, very famous, called 1968, The Global Imagination of the New Left. And he posited this thing that he called the Eros effect. Okay, that people have this innate desire to be free and be the masters of their own destiny. It's a lovely view, but I don't know if human nature is that way. And for some reason that we still don't have a full handle on, every now and again, a lot of people get seized by this desire. 1917, 1948, 1848, sort of 1968. And then it's not really a sort of satisfying sort of social explanation. It's the sort of projection of a sort of moral sort of wish for humanity. Now, in steps Martin, who has the kind of Occam's razor approach. You know, the most effective explanation might be the most simple. And by that I mean he looks sort of literally at contact among radicals across borders. You know, what they read, what they talked about, you know, face-to-face contact. And then documents admirably the extent to which there was a direct mutual influence, especially from America to Germany, in the development of sort of tactics and ideology. And then he could talk about the particulars. I conclude with three questions, and I truly am almost done. Now, the first one has to do with the category of, you know, misapprehension. Okay? And then the Germans and Americans both develop some screwy notions about each other. And then there's a kind of positive and negative mythology of America. So Germans, you know, demonized post-war America as the moral equivalent to Nazi Germany. I mean, this is hyperbolic. And then also idealized the American resistance, believing the Black Panthers could take down the American empire. Or even I read, you know, Acht Drei Drei had this thing saying that the weathermen, you know, were poised to demolish America. This is after the townhouse bombing, when weathermen are running scared, trying to get fake IDs.
Demolishing themselves.
You know, demolishing themselves. You know, and then, so then where does sort of misapprehension fit in? And then one of my favorite, you know, views of the 60s is that it's really all about competing delusions. The delusions on the left, the delusions of Johnson and Nixon, who were fighting a war based on a fraudulent understanding of what it was. And then so many people are sort of prisoners of their own illusions and delusions, and you have this sort of war of misapprehension. It's almost an absurdist view of history. The second question is, some similarities are not explicable by direct contact, and what analytic paradigms allow you to understand similarities when, as Michael sort of testified, the actual knowledge between Germans and Americans about each other may have been actually quite thin. And then the last question, you know, a very central one, is to what extent was the German perception of the United States and things American mediated by the tortured post-war, you know, psychology, where they wanted to see America as, you know, a new aggressor, somehow akin to the Nazis fighting America. They could sort of, you know, sort of compensate for the moral failure of their parents who didn't take up the struggle against, you know, Nazism. So that's my appreciation, analysis, and set of questions.
Thank you very much. Would you like to comment on either of your commenters?
I'm afraid. Well, thank you very much for these very, very kind, generous, and constructive comments. I don't know where to begin, frankly, so I'll probably just pick a few, and then we can come back to them during the discussion. Let me start with the significance of the other during the 60s. I absolutely believe, and I hope that I try to make that clear during the book, that the American scene, American New Left, the American counterculture, is disproportionately more important for the Germans than the other way around. I wouldn't go so far as to say that the German New Left is a footnote for the American SDS, but as you said, Michael, the American SDS predominantly was focused on the domestic scene, you know, to stop the seventh war from now on was one of the phrases, and only engaged in international cooperation when it was directly attached to improving the domestic situation, the national scene. For example, with the Vietnamese, you know, with the Third World, with Cuba. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Of what I tried in the book is to show how these attempts already at the beginning of the 60s are being made by people in the American SDS to establish an international perspective. And how that concept is very, very much contested. And in fact, I would argue, I mean, this is one of the things, as Jeremy argued, this is a general trend or a general phenomenon as far as the 60s in the United States is concerned. You have this internationalist faction, which is always smaller, and you have the massive faction, which is really only interested in what's going on in the United States. And there we come back to this love-hate relationship with the American past. I think Paul Potter once said, we are the sons and daughters of the American dream. Yeah, and Dominic Cavello wrote about that particular perception of American history, which is, I think, also extremely interesting.
If I could just say just one comment on your comment, if it's okay, Don. I wouldn't argue that the American left was not internationalist. I think we were, as you said, in terms of Vietnam and Cuba. I mean, it was very exciting for people like me to go to Cuba. A lot of people went to Europe, to Prague, for example, to meet the Vietnamese. I went to Montreal to meet some people in the Viet Cong. So we really felt like we were, their support troops, so to speak. And it was different with Germany, partly because there was a romance of the Third World. For obvious reasons, was not a romance with Germany. So so it was a different psychology, a different kind of internationalism, I would argue.
Absolutely, and I think with Germany it was a romance with theory. People feel that once they have been to Germany, they have been converted to Marxism. When they return to
Marcuse, of course, as you write about, was crucial for a small but important group of people too.
Yeah, and the other thing is, of course, for the American scene, there's the threat of an immediate draft. Yeah, that's something completely different. And you mentioned that when you talked about the size. I mean, the size is, of course, different, of the movement in the United States and in Germany. One thing about the silence and the guest workers, that is a very, very curious phenomenon. And my argument would be, and I try to make that in the book, that the engagement or the alliance between West German student activists and African-American soldiers, the GI movement that emerges in the 70s, really only opens the door for a discourse on discovering the guest workers as a problem in German society and as something where we also see rampant racism in German society. I mean, that's a whole other topic, which I wouldn't want to go into. Final point, transnationalism, global 60s. I think, and at the very end I'm going to call my star witness for the transnational dimension, Norman Birnbaum here, in terms of how important that transnational dimension actually was. What I would like to say is more like a historiographical comment. I absolutely believe that we're only at the very beginning of understanding how many transnational connections there were, that we're at the beginning of getting the empirical evidence from the government side, from the movement side, and that we're only at the very beginning of comprehending what these meant. Because I would agree with Jeremy that we're talking about, in a lot of ways, imagined alliances, imagined similarities, competing delusions, and one of the tasks of future scholarship is to separate the two.
Thank you. Before I open up to the audience, let me exercise the prerogative of the chair and ask a question myself. I have not, since I was just tapped yesterday for this job, I have not had a chance to read the entire book. I've read parts of it, though, and it's fascinating. But you seem to indicate that this is really the beginning of this whole global movement, yet we've seen precursors to the SDS, for instance, which was part of the League of Industrial Democracy and so on, going back to the 1920s. We saw an international conference of students, including the U.S. in Prague in 1946. Thereafter, the National Student Association was born here in the U.S. I know a little bit of this because I was a delegate for the NSA to its 63 convention at Indiana University. But and even though it was primarily concerned with on-campus matters, they certainly were involved, or there was a lot of workshops on things like apartheid in South Africa, the Portuguese colonies, and so on. I'm just wondering, how much was there a global influence among youth in previous decades? Have you looked into that at all, and what happened to them?
This is a very good question because it also ties into what Michael was talking about the newness, or about the nature of transnational dimensions in the 60s. I don't think that internationalism or transnationalism was invented in the 60s. In fact, a lot of these networks that I'm discussing in the book rely on precursors, whether it be the Communist International, the Trade Union International Connections, the networks, Socialist Internationals, and above all, the anti-war movement, the ban the bomb movement of the 1950s. Yeah, so the peace movement has a very long-standing international tradition, and a lot of what's going on in the 60s is relying on that infrastructure. Now, I would argue that there are two things which are new, of course, in the 60s, and that is the framework of the Cold War, which gives people the chance to operate in a global playing field that is dominated by competing interests of two world powers to bring them on their side. Yeah, so we have massive cultural diplomacy efforts by the U.S. government and also by the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of young people all across the world. And second of all, the technological innovation, that we have all of a sudden instantaneous satellite communication, which beams the images of what's going on in Vietnam to all the households and the living rooms of people in Germany and all across the world. So you have a very, very immediate connection to what's going on in other parts of the world. And I would argue this is a different quality of global connections.
Could I throw in a third thing? I mean, this really comes from Jeremy's story, but it's sort of a fascinating explanation. He points to the university as an important institutional base for transnational youth solidarity. And the argument is that every sort of major player in the Cold War needed to fit their society for Cold War competition and needed educated knowledge workers, engineers, scientists, administrators to do the military, administrative, sort of technological work of power. So they all created these massive, multiversities with an explicit, tied to an explicit sort of national agenda. And then universities became wonderful places to talk to members of your generation, learn things outside of that agenda, like Marxism and existentialism. You have a sort of lot of free time, and they became ideal incubators for activism. And then it's a sort of classic argument of the unintended consequences of this sort of institutional mandate and leadership who explicitly put a challenge to youth, often very idealistic, to be great and do great things and learn and empower yourself. Now, they ended up taking that empowerment and turning them against the societies that empowered them. But I think the university is another, crucial piece, and that didn't exist in the 20s and the 30s and even the 40s to the same extent.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I mean, that is a great point because it helps to explain why young people in the left could think about young people as an age of social change in themselves. I mean, the average age of the Bolsheviks who took power in Petrograd in 1917 was 26. They were young people too. But they didn't say the young people are taking power. They said the proletariat is taking power. And so in many ways, in Marxist terms, to be Marxist for a second, the contradiction, of course, between the growth of this knowledge industry with the university at the center of it and the people who have been trained to run the world, supposedly, turning against the knowledge industry, expropriating the expropriators in their own particular way, was, I think, very powerful. Also very naive, of course, because it wasn't as if this was the whole society and the whole economy, but also helps to explain why all these events a lot of the events Jeremy's talking about and that Martin writes about in his book took place in universities around the world. Conferences took place in universities. It was a natural place to do this kind of thing.
Just a postscript to the National Student Association story in 1967, I think it was Ramparts that had the expose that said the CIA had been funding NSA sort of secretly from the 50s into the 60s, and I didn't see a dime of it, but in any event. Let's open up the questions to the audience now. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and affiliation. We'll start over here.
Well, I want to thank Martin, of course, for this
Name, please.
for the book, and the panel of Michael and Jeremy for a great contribution.
What's your name, Norman?
Oh, my name. I'm Norman Birnbaum, and I lived in England and helped found the British New Left, and then as an American traveled widely. I I can also claim to have taught Les Situationnistes, which some of you may know, when I was a visiting prof at Strasbourg. They later went to Nanterre and ignited or began the ignition of the events of '68. And of course, I had a lot of contacts in Germany as well. But looking back on this, there's one point I'd like, as an American patriot, to dispute. Namely that American culture's attraction had something to do with, or was the direct consequence of American power. If I cite three names, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Chaplin, Ernest Hemingway, it seems to me that their attraction had something to do not with American power as such, but with the seizure of the historical moment. Three figures, by the way, who were immensely popular in a country not otherwise addicted to affirmative views of the United States, namely France. But looking back on the period and my kind of recollections and reflections on it, which I've struggled with all these years, I'm still struck primarily by the rootedness of these movements in national traditions, in national situations, in national forms of expressiveness, national problems. When I remember the disputes inside the British left in the late, the new left in England actually began about 56, 57, and probably could be thought of as the first. When I think of the use of, when I think of the marvelously amusing title of Raymond Aron's book on 68, La Révolution Introuvable, the revolution you couldn't find, the French use of revolution, and the efforts by the German student movement to find and enact a different kind of German history. It seemed to me that the what I call rootedness, sensibility, rhetoric, self-image, we use all of these terms, of the protesting or revolting generation was extremely national and not understandable primarily except in terms of their national situations, however much the international situations interacted with it, collided with it, provided an extension of it. Finally, it does seem to me that there was a terrible book about this period which got a point right. I think it's called, Jeff probably knows it, not because it's terrible, but because Jeff, Louis. No. You wouldn't want to claim it. Louis Foyer's book, I think it was called The Conflict of Generations. Yeah. Yes. Foyer, a very gifted man who became a caricature of an anti-Stalinist, repenting his own past, did, I think, correctly point out that the dimension of generation in this. It crops up in other things, but there were various efforts to analyze it. I think Henri Lefebvre once wrote an essay on "Is Youth a Class?" or something like that. It does seem to me that the notion of generation and a supporting generational analysis of revolt is just an indispensable component of whatever analytic apparatus we wish to bring to these complex events. And it's interesting, just to conclude, it seems to me that there were university protests behind the Iron Curtain or in the Soviet bloc, but the place where these protests had the most impact or were really developed were in the research institutes, in the academies of science, the research centers in countries like Czechoslovakia, Poland, even in the most rigid and limited of those countries, the German Democratic Republic. In the research centers, the younger researchers, and indeed some of the older ones, somehow seized what free space they had to take up some of these themes of revolt, the new labor force, and science or knowledge or knowledge workers as a social category. But there's a lot more to be said, but I do think that I'm still struck by that national rootedness, national language. When Bertrand Russell launched and a couple of bishops launched what became the great popular anti-nuclear protest in Great Britain, they did so in a very national and a very British way. They wrote a letter to the Times.
Thank you very much. Any comments on that, or other questions? Let's go with Jeffrey Hartz over here. The other half of our missing moderator.
The better half is missing. I've read Martin's fine book, and congratulations. I fully agree with what both Michael and Jerry said. It really is an important scholarly contribution. So I'll be brief. I think that one reason that so many protests took place in so many parts of the world was because of the Tet Offensive of January in 1968. And I've used the expression in other places, Hegelian moment, to refer to that event, because, and this is related to the point that Jeremy made about illusions. Those of us in the New Left then, I'll spare the biographical details, thought the Vietnamese communists were going to win the war. And that as a result of that perception of victory and of defeating the United States, things changed. Up to January 1968, the focus was on the awful things the United States was doing to this passive and victimized group of people called the Vietnamese. And you all use the expression the Vietnamese, which is an echo of 1968. Because when you talk about solidarity with people around the world, the New Left had no solidarity with those people in South Vietnam who didn't want to live under a communist regime. They were no less Vietnamese than the Vietnamese communists that the New Left was supporting. Because by 1968, the New Left objectively, and for many people, especially in leadership positions, subjectively, was a pro-communist movement in West Germany and in the United States. People had to be very stupid or very naive to think the New Left was not a pro-communist movement in regard to the outcome of the war in Vietnam. In the book, you use the phrase liberation struggles around the world. Now, it's a long time since those liberation struggles have become governments. So it troubles me to use that expression, liberation struggles. They were communist movements that established communist governments, that established communist dictatorships, that ruined the economies of those countries and destroyed human rights. There's nothing liberating about what they did. I think the difficulty in writing about this is to talk at the same time about the American Air War, about what happened to the civilian population in Vietnam, about the thousands of people who were killed, to keep that in mind, and then on the other hand, to keep in mind the fact that we were fighting communists and that they won. They won the war. Mm-hmm. And that's something that historians of the New Left, I think, have not yet fully addressed. In terms of the scholarship to come, I think addressing the question of communism in the New Left is one that needs to be addressed. I also think, in terms of the other alliance, in the book you don't address a great deal the Six-Day War of 1967. That was extremely important for the American New Left, and it was even more important, probably a defining element for the West German left. And in terms of the national context, maybe Jeremy wants to comment on this, there are historians of the West German New Left who argue that the conflict in the Middle East became even more important in West Germany than the war in Vietnam. But I want to end on a positive note. It's a very important scholarly contribution. You've pushed our knowledge of these events, further ahead. I would second what Michael said. I think that the preoccupation of some intellectuals in the American New Left was with the Frankfurt schools, with events in Germany, advanced industrial capitalism, that kind of thing. But on the whole, it was about the Vietnamese, the Third World, Che, etc.
Comments? Yes.
Let me make 3 comments on the issues raised by the two of you. National traditions. I think one cannot underestimate, and this is what Jeremy also alluded to, the impact of the National Socialist past for the West German student movement. You see it everywhere. You see it in the comparative frame that student activists use to describe Vietnam. You see it in the analysis of what's going on in their own society. So this is one of the examples where you really see the national factor being very, very preeminent. And I also want to be clear about the nature of transnational studies. I think it would be a grave mistake to underestimate in any kind of transnational study the issue and the major dimension that the national factor always plays. And I wanted to make clear in the book that what's important is how these international examples are being appropriated and then used in a national context. Yeah, that's sort of being said. Now to Jeff, the pro-communist movement. And also the second question about the Six-Day War. I think probably if we talk about silences in scholarship or blind spots in scholarships on the 60s, I think the issue of anti-Semitism, especially with regard to the West Germany left, is one that needs much, much more exploration. There has been a lot of work by people like Wolfgang Kraushaar, who wrote a book on a bomb attack that was thwarted eventually on the Jewish community house. There has been a lot of literature on the notion or the relationship to Israel and the Palestinians on the side of the Red Army faction and of West German student movements. I think there needs to be more to really get that straight, because I think the Six-Day War is a great event in that particular ideological mindset that develops at the end of the 60s. The pro-communist movement, I think we have to be very careful here. I think for West Germans, as you know, people like Rudi Dutschke came from East Germany. So they had a very, I would argue, interesting and intricate and direct experience of what communism in East Germany was like. Now, I'm not saying they didn't have communist sympathies or illusions or whatever you want to call it, but there is a larger dimension here. There's an interesting story when Rudi Dutschke comes to Prague before August, sometime in the summer of '68, and he sits down with like-minded students in Prague, and they have an extremely difficult time understanding one another, because they are, of course, looking toward the Western, seeing reform movements, democracy as something that they aspire to in a lot of ways, whereas Rudi Dutschke displays some illusions about what the Prague Spring and life in communist Czechoslovakia is all about. So you have, again, this notion of misapprehension here. So I wouldn't be too quick to jump that all of the new left at the end of the 60s were the pro-communist movement. I think there's a renaissance of communism. There's an admiration of Mao, of China, the role of Red China, that really jumpstarts in the 70s for West Germany in particular, the K groups. And we have similar things, of course, in the United States, which Michael can speak on with progressive labor and all of that. So it gets a lot more complicated when we talk about communism, Maoism at the end of the 60s and 70s.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I mean, is that okay? I mean, just briefly, first to your point, you know, there's limits to a transnational analysis, and I think now it's very fashionable to sort of exaggerate how transnational everything was. But there's also limits to an overly national analysis, and then it all depends on where you're talking about. And then we just published in our journal an essay by a Czech fellow called Checking the Beats, which was about the enormous influence beat poets had in Czechoslovakia. And then partly they did not have a usable nationalist past because the communists had sort of completely destroyed any analysis other than scientific socialistic. And then they admired American freedoms as expressed by Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti, you know, the defiance of linguistic conventions. And apparently, you know, people could recite pages of Ferlinghetti in Czechoslovakia in 1967. And that, you know, they're way outsell those authors, you know, what they sort of sell in the West. And then as to, you know, Jeffrey's question, you know, this sort of hard turn towards communism was, I think, a fateful mistake. And I described to some of my students, you know, recently, a real low point in the American New Left was when Bernardine Dorn, newly elected as the whatever of SDS, declares, I am a revolutionary communist, as though this is supposed to, you know, change the world. You know, however, in their defense, I think a lot of Americans were sort of so naive that didn't mean a whole lot. I mean, if you're 18 and you're just becoming politicized, it's a label you might sort of quickly wear. without any deep commitment to it. So there's a difference between the ideologues and a kind of rank and file. You know, after the Paris Peace Accords were initiated secretly, something like 800,000 or 400,000 Vietnamese civilians died. You know, so the air war and the suffering of the Vietnamese people remained for a long time a big mobilizing factor that could come separate from, I want the Viet Cong to win and I want the dominoes to fall and the sort of red, you know, menace to spread. And then the last thing, you know, Paul Berman, who I generally don't like, has a wonderful book called A Tale of Two Utopias. And then for him, the best of the 60s was its liberal, democratic impulses. The heroes are the Czechs, who wanted to be free in that sort of fundamental freedom of expression kind of way, gays and lesbians, women who wanted formal rights, legal rights, and rights of recognition. They, you know, made the fateful error of affiliating with communism, but it's a kind of morally attractive and historically plausible rendition of things, which might be a very American view, that these quintessential American, you know, political values kind of glow global. But as he describes it, it does feel like emancipation within a broadly humanist vocabulary that we can, you know, embrace, and I think it still has a lot of power to it, despite his own hard turn towards neoliberal apologia.
Michael?
A couple comments. I'm appalled to hear that Ferlinghetti was so popular, but not a very good poet. Sorry, but better. They were translating Ginsberg, but they probably were doing that too. But a couple quick comments, and you know, both these responses have been great. First, you know, one of the things that, talking about anti-Semitism in Germany, one of the things that perhaps not enough has been made of is how Jewish the White New Left was. Roughly half of the core activists of the White New Left were Jewish, and some of the centers of the New Left, as you might expect, places like Berkeley, New York City, Boston, where I was, Chicago, it was probably 2/3, if not more. So there, the Nazi metaphor was pretty powerful. I won't tell you all these anecdotes I have about that, but you know, there are a lot of Jewish radicals I knew were used to spray painting U.S. equals swastika on walls of their campus buildings and other parts of urban areas. And it wasn't just Jews doing that, but clearly the Holocaust and the Nazis, the whole sense of U.S. being another Nazi Germany was lively in the United States, in part because so many Jews were in the White New Left. Only in part, of course. It's historical memory, not just of Jews. But on the question of communism, well, again, perhaps obvious to those of you who know something about the New Left, but in other words, sometimes the obvious has to be stated too. There was communism. There was communism. Clearly, Soviet-style communism and its allies. That was not the kind of communism the New Left was identifying with. In '68, at the Democratic Convention, where, you know, famously demonstrators went to oppose the Democratic Party and its sponsorship and leadership of the war policy, and a police riot took place. A lot of people were arrested immediately. This happened right after the crushing of Socialism in the Human Face in Czechoslovakia. Immediately you saw graffiti saying Czech Gago, combining, you know, Czech and Chicago. That was the immediate metaphor which came, the reference which came to mind for a lot of people. And that was true for people who had this romance with Vietnamese communism and Cuban communism, and to a certain degree with Chinese communism. That was actually less universal, I think. So, and as Jeremy said, I think it's important that there was this very naive romance with these people, and you know, those who had it, and I was certainly one of them, really tried to get away from the Leninist side to it. We really wanted to see these people as sort of democratic peasants, you know, who were building a sort of grassroots movement from the ground up, and the kind of writing there was done, at least in the United States, about the Vietnamese and about the Cubans, really very much underplayed the power of the Communist Communist Party here, which is very different, of course, than people who were actually communists with a capital C had done earlier. For them, of course, the Leninist Party as the engine of world revolution was key, whereas for most, at least American New Leftists, I can't speak for German New Leftists, we underplayed that as much as possible. We were, in other words, we might have called ourselves communists, but we really thought the communists were just another kind of Democrat. And with a small d, and that was critical, I think. But one of the things which has happened, I think, since the '60s, is that a lot of that romance of communism has been exposed, in fact, and I think Paul Berman, I would defend a little bit as having helped to expose that, though I don't agree with him about the Iraq War. But I do think that one of that, and this is even before '89. A lot of people, New Left veterans, had sort of cured themselves, I think, of that particular attraction. I'm now co-editor of a magazine which have led to that, Dissent magazine, which, for all its other flaws in the '60s, continually was telling people in the New Left, people call themselves communists, and they say that they think what Lenin and Stalin did was okay. Then maybe you should take them at their word. But I do think that the historiography has underplayed the question of communism, to a degree. But the historians themselves, I think, have, at least in their own politics, have cured themselves of that.
Okay, other questions? Just bring the microphone over here. A brief follow-up comment.
When the anti-de Gaulle movement, the events of '68 in France collapsed, it was due immediately to the intervention of the communist-led union, the CGT, which made an agreement with the government, the so-called Accords of the Rue de Grenelle. And obviously, they did it directly. Obviously, I didn't see the documents, but it's a good assumption that they did it at the instructions of the Soviet Union, which was an enthusiastic supporter of General de Gaulle for reasons obvious and less so, and the French Communist Party limped and coughed. And was generally outplayed and embarrassed by the events of '68. As far as Germany goes, everybody who was in the Berlin city administration, which then was social democratic, will say or testify, and again, I haven't seen the documents, that the minute there was a student disturbance in Berlin in the '60s, their liaison persons in the administration on the other side of the wall immediately got in touch with them and said, you must put this down. We don't want this amount of disorder in the city. And it's interesting that of all the East Bloc countries, movements of this kind was, so to speak, least visible, at least on the surface, in the late unlamented DDR.
One of the interesting things from Martin's book that I noticed was that both Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt were members of the German SDS in their younger days.
That was before it was. That was when it was part of the SPD.
Okay, as part of the it was the youth arm of the party. Yes.
Can I just say one more thing about the communist thing that just since you mentioned East Germany. I mean, for East Germany, of course, one of the key things was to get control of the West German student movement, and they tried so, various times. And it just recently came out that one of the the person who shot Rudi Dutschke was actually on the wage list of the East German secret intelligence agency.
Dutschke. Oh, no.
Ben Ohlensdorf, I'm sorry. Ben Ohlensdorf, yeah. So Karl-Heinz Kohlhaas. No, I don't want to get No.
Great book, yeah.
But what's interesting here is that that the communists in East Germany are actually embarrassed by the behavior of a lot of West German student activists. For example, the Commune 1, sort of the countercultural branch of the West German student movement, shows up in East Germany with the Little Red Books. which is, of course, a great embarrassment to East Germany. They don't know how to deal with that, and that's by and large the sentiment and the conclusion that the CIA also comes to. You know, when it's confronted at that infamous cabinet meeting in September of '68 by President Johnson, who says clearly there has to be a communist conspiracy here. You know, he cannot be persuaded otherwise, and people like Richard Helms or Ward Rostow really put forward a very nuanced and complex analysis that yes, there are connections, that yes, there's the attempt to manipulate, but no, there is no control, and there never was. And that's something that is being refuted back then already.
I think we had another hand up right here.
Hi, I'm Casey Sutcliffe at the German Historical Institute. I was thinking about the question of the influence of the German student movement on America. As you pointed out, it was more American influence on Germany than the other way around. But I was thinking that doesn't it play some role that you had so many German immigrant scholars in the United States, because these student movements were primarily taking place on university campuses. University campuses already are, well, I don't want to say that they're very international, but they were much more international than the surrounding community. You had Angela Davis studying with Herbert Marcuse, and then she also goes to Germany to study and then brings back what she's learned over there and carries it forth. And whether that can't be some way that you can pursue more of a connection with clearly, the most obvious, you've got Marxism and German philosophical thought underpinning a lot of this kind of stuff, but more importantly, the person-to-person contact with the scholars who were at the universities. And then on the point of misapprehension, I was just thinking about the East German appropriation of the civil rights movement and Angela Davis's visit over there as well. If the New Left, American New Left, misunderstood true communism, it seems that the East Germans also misunderstood what was really going on in the civil rights movement as well, appropriating it for their own ends.
I mean, just to address that briefly, I mean, of course, Herbert Marcuse is one of the towering figures in this transatlantic connection, one who's not only a mentor on both sides of the Atlantic, but one who's also actively pursuing and supporting this particular alliance. And I think we have somebody else sitting here who at least, mediated this exchange or served as a contact point here in the United States about what was going on in Germany and able to explain to American students what was going on right there. I think one of the other things that we haven't really talked about is one of the great ironies of Cold War cultural diplomacy is that a lot of student activist radicals of the late 60s were in one way or another affiliated with exchange programs sponsored by the U.S. government at the beginning of the 60s. There's Michael Vester there, who's here in the United States on a Fulbright grant. There's Karl Dietrich Wolff, who goes to high school in Michigan, where he sort of experiences the first stirrings of the civil rights movement. One could argue that in a lot of ways American cultural diplomacy worked just too well for the American government in this transatlantic field. And with regard to East Germany, that's a whole other area that remains to be explored. The African-American civil rights movement was, of course, of great interest to East Germany, because that was one of the clear weaknesses internationally that it could exploit with regard to American democracy and its democratic, the mission of the U.S. empire abroad. And they did so forcefully all throughout the 60s. It's interesting to see what happens when people like Paul Robeson, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and then eventually Angela Davis come to East Berlin and how their visits are being framed for the East German propaganda purposes.
Not sure it was mentioned in your book, maybe it was, but Marcuse detested being called the father of the New Left. Why was that?
Well, I mean, there's a long controversy unfolding about Marcuse and his role as far as the New Left is concerned. Recent scholarship basically argues that he was more driven by the New Left than he was the driving force. So I think that sentiment stems from that. And, speaking of Marcuse's role with regard to Angela Davis here, he, of course, was not happy about Angela Davis going to East Germany. and not denouncing the human rights violations in East Germany. And there we come back, of course, to Jeff's point about communism and the tension that were attached to that.
Just one little anecdote about Marcuse. There was a furious debate for a short time, at least, within the American SDS between two major factions, which eventually helped to split it. The, you might say, New Left faction and Progressive Labor Party, which is Maoist group. And Progressive Labor Party published in the newspaper, I remember very well, called Challenge, 3 or 4 page feature about how Marcuse was actually agent of the CIA because he worked for the OSS during World War II. So they said, don't read Marcuse, he's working for the CIA still. It's a little like the birthers who think that Obama was born in Kenya. But they obviously, this Maoist faction, Maoist-Stalinist faction, believed that Marcuse was somehow inserted by the CIA to turn American new leftists away from the true path of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. Really, they actually said that.
Any other questions? Yes. We have a question over here.
Hi, I'm Peter Range, a journalist currently masquerading as a marketing director at a law firm. My little footnote that I want to contribute here is that I, like some others in the room, experienced a lot of this firsthand, both the civil rights movement on our side and the German student movement on the other side. And when I arrived in Berlin, I had been a student earlier in West Germany, but when I arrived in Berlin as a journalist in 1967, just in time to see Benno Ohnesorg be killed and to be out there that night when the Shah came, one of the first things I was struck by, well, let me back up a second. I'm going to try to both support and refute Norman's point about the national rootedness.
Support and refute?
Yes. A journalist who can teach you round or flat. I was struck immediately by the fact that this burgeoning, before the events of that June night, this burgeoning student movement, it seemed to me, had to flow directly from our movement, from the American civil rights movement. And it should be remembered, by the way, that the anti-war movement in the late 60s was in many ways, I think, unthinkable without the civil rights movement that went before it. Because before that you had the 50s where nothing happened. So you had to have a civil rights movement which legitimized the notion of direct action and mass protest and going in the streets, which was absolutely not a done thing when I was growing up. So anyway, I arrived in Germany. They seemed to me to be following in the footsteps of our movement. But then very quickly they became very German, it seemed to me, which in many cases meant turning violent. Nothing better illustrates it than the events of that June night when the Shah was went to the opera and the cobblestones began to be dug up from the streets of Berlin and thrown. And I was standing right next to a policeman whose skull was caved in by one of those cobblestones, at which point I decided I ought to get on the other side because the police weren't throwing any rocks, even though they gave chase a lot and we had to run a lot, which is how I happened to be standing near the spot where Benno Ohnesorg was shot. And this image and this contradiction occurred to me over and over and over again over the next 12 months as I was always out there whenever anything happened. That was my job. And I saw the Germans getting into fights with one another, even if only verbally. And I was coming from this passive resistance, peaceful demonstration tradition of the American civil rights movement. And I kept wondering, why don't they get it? Don't they understand? You win by doing nothing. You win by sitting down, or you win by being peaceful to the point that they might get violent, the police attack. Although in the American civil rights movement, that was not a necessary component of the success. So I take your point, Norman, that there were, in this, at least in this sort of superficial sense, they were coming out of a much more intolerant European tradition, all the way back to the 19th century, of kind of going quickly to the barricades. I mean, that's what they were metaphorically doing. One of the big symbols, and it was always complained about in the newspapers and in the Springer Press the next day, was breaking the vitrinen, the glass showcases up and down the Kurfürstendamm, which was easy to do, an easy target, but also an unnecessary target, it seemed to me, coming from my kind of rosy southern white liberal background. So anyway, that is a tiny footnote to the whole story. And once again, let me echo everybody else who's thanking you, Martin, for this great contribution to our understanding of this time.
Any comments? Jeremy?
I mean, I made a thorough sort of study of the German violence, and then, without indulging sort of cliches, there did seem differences in sensibilities, and then there was just like a harshness and an edge to the Germans, that a lack of soft edges that you didn't see in the Americans. And, there was a professor of mine, David Bathrick, who some of you might know, who was heavily involved in movements on both sides of the Atlantic, and he said the first time he went to Germany to give a public lecture in German to an audience of leftists, his fear wasn't speaking in German, it was the aggressiveness and intensity with which he knew his interlocutors would, take him apart. And there's sort of tonal things. And he said even when they were being whimsical, there was something manic about the whimsy. And their chief sort of provocateur was Fritz Teufel, whose name means devil in German, and he was the clown of the movement. So, this gives you some sense of it. Then one point, I'm sorry, this is a little bit off topic, but just to complicate things, like there's other global narratives. And a whole other one has to do with African Americans and what we now call the Global South, which had its own internationalism. And then people sort of may or may not know that in the 50s, a lot of African Americans in Harlem, but also in the South, followed events in Africa. There was a takeover of the Security Council in 1961 after the assassination of Lumumba, in which Maya Angelou participated. Castro came to Harlem in 1960. Nkrumah came to Harlem. Martin Luther King went to Ghana. Robert Williams went to Cuba. In 1968, Kwame Ture, a.k.a. Stokely Lee Carmichael, went to Algeria, Cuba, Bratislava.
Tanzania, I was there.
Tanzania, Peking. And this is Hanoi, perhaps the great global itinerary of a figure who embodies transnationalism. And this is within an anti-colonial context. It has its own naivete and romance and so forth. But there also was a sense in which sort of people of color, a bit of an anachronistic term, felt a sense of affinity, were rising up, developing critiques, networks of knowledge. So this is, in a way, a kind of white narrative. Not to say it's invalid, but in the last 5 years, we've learned so much that the average person who's well-versed in the 60s had no idea about, because of the pretty, heroic work of a small handful of scholars who were just rewriting this stuff. So, yes, it's a tired subject in ways. I wish the 60s would go away. But, just when you think you've heard it all, your mind is blown by something totally new.
One comment just about that. I certainly agree with Jeremy that the transnational turn, has bequeathed a lot of wonderful stuff. There's an interesting book by Glenda Gilmore called Defying Dixie, where she chronicles in great detail trips to the Soviet Union by African American leftists in the 1920s, led by Langston Hughes and others, to make a film, which actually never got made. But how comfortable a lot of African Americans were with going to the Soviet Union. And later on, of course, in the 60s, in the 50s, people go to other parts of the world as well. But again, to reiterate the point I was making and Norman was making too, I think, what difference did all that make, on what actually was happening in the left in the United States? I think that's a key question. I mean, certainly, there was, it was important. Malcolm X's really outsized influence had a lot to do with how much he talked about the world. And before he died, he wanted to bring the U.S. up on charges for violating human rights for the United Nations. Did not get to do that, of course. But in the end, I think what was going on, both in the black and white lefts, was the dynamic was much more about could you put pressure on Southern sheriffs? Could you put pressure on the national administrations, beginning with FDR and going on through Johnson and Nixon? The trajectory of the movement in the U.S. had a lot more to do with what was happening in American politics and American culture than I think it did with the frisson of being part of a world movement. That might be old-fashioned to say, but in the end, what matters, I think in history is, what is the question, what difference does something make? And I think these transnational connections, as important as they are, it has to be shown, how they actually had an impact on events in these particular cultures, in these particular countries, or in world history as a whole, which is, a somewhat different question.
Pardon?
When I was writing the book and, I was discovering all these connections between the activists in West Germany and the United States, I, of course, anticipated, that kind of comment because, after all, this other alliance failed. It's very clear that, the Cold War still went on. So I was thrilled to find some evidence from government and establishment sources to sort of confirm the argument that they actually had an impact. Now we can argue, and other people have, like Jeremy Suri, about the actual impact and whether that changed foreign policy or not during the 60s, what the implications of détente on all of this are. But just give you one example. When Germany in 2001 after the September 11 attacks, and then the year following when the U.S. decided to invade Iraq and beginning the Iraq War, when Germany refused to participate in that particular war, the former Chancellor of West Germany, Helmut Kohl, blamed the hesitancy or the refusal of that particular political decision on the anti-Americanism of the New Left, which was, according to him, now in the reins of power with Gerhard Schröder and Joschka Fischer as part of the Red-Green coalition. And that is something that got me thinking. And there's an interview published by in Der Spiegel, I think, in 2002, where the journalist asked Joschka Fischer about his image of America during the 1960s, and he comes out and says very, very clearly, for us there was always, this ambivalence that Jeremy was talking about. There's this one America which was, of course, waging a war in Vietnam, and there's the other America, of resistance, of counterculture, of all of that, and that is something that I always attached myself to, in his words. And I believe this ambivalence and the maturity of the alliance coming out of the 60s, the complexity that the image of the United States got all of a sudden has been shaping the transatlantic alliance up to now, and it still determines of what we now conceive of as the Western alliance and its limits. So I think, there you have a very, very concrete impact of these transnational opening of the 60s, I would argue.
Before I call on Jeffrey Hartz for a second question, is there anybody who has not asked a question that would like to ask one? If not,
or comment.
Or a comment, yes. If not, we'll just give Jeffrey the last question, and then we'll adjourn for a little wine and cheese and buy some books.
I return to this issue about transnationalism and nationalism. If you reread the Weatherman statement of 1969, it is infused with the conceptual foundation of the international communist left of the 20th century. It is not simply a result of American radicalism. It's Hegelian, it's Marxist, it situates the New Left in the context of an international revolution. And I don't know whether that came from Marcuse, from Duchka, but the Germans certainly spoke that language better than anyone else. And the Germans were very Vietnamese-oriented, too. It may be that they were in the streets marching, chanting Hoa, Ho Chi Minh, the NLF is going to win, before it happened here in Washington. What's striking about these different national contexts is that by 1968 and 69, around the world, they were speaking a similar language, which I think, I'm repeating the point. No, it was not communism in the Soviet Union or primarily Maoism, but it was a kind of third world international communist language. And a point about naivete and innocence. By 1968-69, the leadership of SDS in the United States was not that young. And we were all people were in their 20s. They were a little bit older than I was in early 20s. People were not naive or innocent. They were idealistic, yes, but pretty sophisticated, aware of some fairly complicated works of history and social science, and that, yes, that was a minority of the movement. It wasn't the rank and file, but I don't think that that the American left was uninfluenced by a flow of ideas around the world.
Well, I just read an excerpt of Mark Rudd's book Underground, and he says basically, yes, we were very naive in thinking that we could precipitate an international revolution, but that's his sort of mea culpa, I think.
I mean, let me just jump in to say that, I mean, naive doesn't, I don't take it to mean that there's no culpability. I mean, it can be an insult, not, naive because innocent and starry-eyed. I think a lot of them actually were profoundly ignorant. And then Bill Ayers said, we didn't know anything about anything. We asked Stanley Aronowitz to give us crash courses on Marxism so we could argue with PL. Jeff, what's his name again? The guy
Jones.
who died, no, not Jeff Jones, the other one. JJ, who wrote the Weatherman statement, was a PL veteran, had learned this runic language of international communism by sectarian wackos, And I think the absence of history, of a sense of history in a twisted way, is what made them fundamentally so American. And the absence of their sense of their own history is what fed this overstrong attachment on the fly to this internationalism. And so in a way,
Having a very good time.
well, sure.
They're enjoying it. They got off on it.
Yeah, but in maturity, I mean, Bernardine Dorn said, maybe there's a good Maoism somewhere, but I've never seen it. It turned us into idiots. I mean, and that's not a profound reckoning with the past, but I think in their maturity they kind of admit they got deeply caught up in something that had, pretty dangerous consequences domestically. But there's got to be a space for trying to, do right by people undergoing, the assaults of power.
Final comment. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to straddle these two histories: the history of wanting to, help people who are under tremendous assault, completely unjustified assault, I still believe, in Vietnam, and for that matter, Cambodia, Laos, trying to overthrow the government of Cuba, 1961, and on and on and on. I won't go through the litany of Cold War, issues, but on the other hand, believing that somehow there was a way to have a communism that was not capital C communism. That was the naive part, I believe. But I want to make one comment about the transnational connection, which I think someone should write a very good book about. Maybe someone has, but which is looking at the sort of new class from the other side. That is one of Jeremy was making mention of this in different words in his comments in the beginning. That is, all these the people who went to college, who became social workers, who became public interest lawyers, who became liberal Democrats or SPD or Green Party activists on the German side. There is a lot of similarities there, I think, between what happened to people who were in the New Left in the 60s and what they did since then, last 10, 20 years. And I think it's fascinating, whenever I go and talk to people in Europe, there's a lot of connection between, people like me and others who knew Left at the time, and perhaps more in what we became than what we were then in certain ways. I'm fascinated by the sociology of that. I'm fascinated by the degree to which that changed and did not change the politics of our respective countries. And to a certain extent, there was a post-New Left International, I think, which someone could write a really wonderful book about. Perhaps you have to wait till we die, but it's something. Duchka talked about the need to make a long march through the institutions, and in effect, the New Left did that. Didn't do it as radicals, it did it as liberals, reformers, social democrats, but it did do it.
Let me give the author the final word, and we'll continue the conversation just outside.
Just going back on that idea of communism, I think words have consequences. So I would be with you on that. I mean, one cannot engage some kind of rhetoric and that not be responsible, and that ties into what you said about culpability. And that has been explored with Duchke's comments on violence, his call for revolutionary violence, and urban guerrilla. At the same time, I think we would make a mistake if we just look at the the higher level of the leadership, whatever that means with the case of West German and American SDS here. I mean, I think it is absolutely clear by now that, and I mentioned that at in my initial comments, that I believe that we shouldn't only look at the political consequences of 60s activism, but even more so on the cultural consequences. And you hinted at that. I mean, the cultural liberalization, the democratization in large parts of society, gay, lesbian issues, all sorts of things, and the fact that the German political party landscape changed fundamentally with the emergence of the Green Party. And I would, just as a frame of comparison, look at the beginning of the 80s, and you know that better than anyone, the new anti-nuclear armament movement of the 1980s was a fundamentally different movement in West Germany than the 60s, because it drew on a lot more grassroots initiatives and a much broader spectrum of society, and I think by and large that is a legacy of what was going on in the 60s.
Very good. Please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you. Books are available to be bought outside, as well as some wine and cheese for free.
So nice to meet you. I was in